back to another video. This week I am keeping on with the stash busting. As you can see, we've made a dent. We've also got a little bit of space here, so we're really making progress with this and I'm very excited to keep going. This week I'm going to be working with this cotton sateen. This is originally from Minerva. It's called Petal Spray, and I have a blouse that I made from this fabric, I think last year. And I wear that all the time, but obviously now it's too warm, so I want a short sleeve or like a sleeveless blouse out of this. If you're new here, hi, I'm Olga and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. So I think this would be super great for a nice little like everyday blouse. And I have exactly the perfect one. I made this blouse right here I think about 2 years ago, and I love it and I do wear it all the time. The only thing is I think I made it a size too small because it is a little bit too tight around the bust. If you remember, I made this other blouse right here, which is basically the same pattern but without the ruffles and a different collar, and I did make that one a size up, and I definitely feel a lot more comfortable in that. But that also means that I already have the pattern pieces traced out for this project. Really, I just have to put this together and that should be a breeze because this is a sleeveless blouse. So the pattern, if you don't know, let me just grab it real quick, is from this book right here, which is Breaking the Pattern by Named Clothing. Let's get into it. Alrighty, so I started by folding my fabric with right sides together and laying it out on my desk. I have just over 1 meter of fabric, so probably have to do some pattern gymnastics, but that will just mean fewer scraps and leftovers, which is the whole point of this stash busting business. At this stage, it seemed like maybe I wouldn't have enough fabric for everything, so I decided to leave the collar out for now and see if I couldn't piece it together out of a bigger offcut later. If you're a beginner and you're wondering why I don't move the pieces a bit to fit everything, it's because I have to keep the grain lines in mind. The grain line is marked on your pattern with a long arrow, and that line should be parallel with the selvages of your fabric when you lay it out. I have a video all about fabric basics if you want to know more about this topic. Once I have all my pattern pieces laid out successfully, I can start cutting them out. Then I grabbed this big offcut to cut out the collar, but without a fold, I had to piece it. Of course, I had to add the seam allowance to that center line so that I can sew the 2 lines to form a whole collar piece, but I think in a busy fabric like this, it won't really be noticeable. Here I also transferred the markings on the pattern over to the fabric. I had a few notches, but the most important thing really to transfer is the darts at the back. I also cut out the interfacing for the collar and stand collar pieces, which is linked below. I have been forgetting to use interfacing in the last few projects for some reason, but I think I have finally broken that weird curse now. Then I started pinning the darts on the back piece. I also pinned the center of the collar pieces with right sides together. I stitched my darts, leaving the thread tails long at the tips as always to tie them off manually. And I stitched the collar centers together here too. I pressed the collar seams open. There's no need to finish the raw edges because they will be encased in the collar. I also pressed the darts towards the side seams and trimmed the thread tails to about 1 inch or 2 centimeters after tying them off a few times. While the iron is on, I also went ahead and fused the interfacing to the collar and stand collar. You just need to interface one of each. I put those to the side and started putting the back of the blouse together. First, I pinned one yoke piece to the back with right sides together. Then I flipped that over and pinned the other yoke piece to the back with the right side of the yoke facing the wrong side of the back piece. This way, while sewing, I'm effectively doing the outside and the facing of the yoke in one go. Once I've stitched that in place, I trim the seam allowance and stitch my tag to the facing while I wait for the iron to warm up. When pressing, I usually press the outside yoke up away from the back, making sure that I'm pressing the seam allowance up as well. And then I press the yoke facing up in the same way. Then I top stitched that and moved on to working on the fronts of the blouse. I actually looked at the instructions at this point, albeit very briefly, and I realized something. I was supposed to cut a princess seam back and not a yoke back. You may be wondering why that is, and it's because in order to sew the ruffles into the blouse, I would need the seam down the back just like I have down the front. Obviously, I don't have any more fabric because this is stash busting, so I had to come up with a creative solution. My first thought was actually to scrap the ruffles altogether, but I really thought the ruffles made this top a lot more cute and playful and feminine, and I really didn't want to scrap them. So I decided to just do the front ruffles. It'll still be cute, and honestly, I never look at the back of what I'm wearing anyway. I started putting the ruffle together, but I sewed all around except at the top of the ruffle, and I was only supposed to sew the bottom closed, but I'll make it work. After I wrongly stitched the ruffle into a tube, I trimmed the seam allowances, flipped it right side out, and pressed. Then I added some gathering stitches on one of the sides. I chose the one with the fold instead of the seam to make it a bit easier to sew into the blouse. I tie off one side of the gathering stitches to make it easier to pull on the other side and start pulling. When I was happy with the size of the ruffle, I started arranging the gathers and pinning it to the front piece along the princess seam. Then I placed the side front over the front with right sides together and pinned, sandwiching the ruffle. If you want, you can also stitch the ruffles down to the front and then pin the side front and stitch that again. I stitched that down, taking it really slow. To finish these raw edges, I trimmed the seam allowances and then I zigzagged them on my machine. And of course, I pressed the seam allowance towards the side, making sure that the ruffle is getting pressed towards the side as well. Then I pinned the fronts to the outer yoke along the shoulder seams with right sides together, leaving the facing yoke free. I made sure to be catching the top edge of the ruffle in this seam. Next, I pinned the side seams of the front and backs together as well. I stitched all of those seams over on the machine in one go. Then I trimmed the edges and zigzagged them. I really only needed to zigzag the sides, which I definitely reminded myself of when I was trimming the seam allowances. But then when I was actually sewing, I got distracted thinking about something else, and when I realized I had already done one of them, so it's okay. Anyway, I pressed all of those seams, making sure to press the shoulder seams towards the back. And I also pressed the seam allowance of the shoulder seam on the yoke facing in. I did that so I can pin it over the shoulder seam and sew it by hand. This is one of those techniques that is kind of purely for the aesthetics, but it's also little things like this that take your clothes from looking homemade to looking professional. I'm going to sew this by hand, but you could also baste it and top stitch it if you wanted to. Then I pressed the button placket in place. I first pressed the seam allowance on the raw edge in, and then I press along the fold line. Usually your pattern has 2 fold lines marked, as well as the center front line, which will be where you place the buttons and the buttonholes. Now it's time to put the collar together. I start by pinning the collar pieces to each other with right sides together along the short side edges and the longer top edge. I stitch that in place, pivoting at the corners. Then I clip the corners and trim the seam allowances to reduce the bulk when I flip it right side out. With the help of a point turner, I make sure my corners are nice and crisp, and then I press the collar flat. Matching the centers, I pin the shorter edge of the stand collar to the raw edge of the collar. The uninterfaced stand collar goes on the uninterfaced side of the collar with right sides together. Then I flip that over and pin the interfaced collar stand to the interfaced side of the collar with right sides together, sandwiching the collar in between the stand collar pieces. When sewing this together, I leave the seam allowance of the long edge of the stand collar free. I then trim the seam allowances, flip this right side out, and press everything again. I added top stitching to the seam I just stitched along the rounded edges and the top of the stand collar, as well as the whole edge of the collar. This is obviously optional, but since I already have some top stitching on this blouse and I think there will be more, I thought this would help to make it all look cohesive. Finally, I press in the seam allowance of the uninterfaced stand collar. This will make the next few steps a little bit easier. Now I can pin the interfaced side of the stand collar to the blouse with right sides together, leaving the folded edge of the uninterfaced side free. I like to match the center of the stand collar to the center of the yoke to make sure that I am getting the correct placement, and I pin out from there towards each side. When I get to the button plackets, I open them out and pin them to the inside of the blouse along the second fold line, encasing the collar stand. Then I carefully stitch that in place, making sure I am rearranging my fabric when necessary to make sure I don't get any weird tucks and lumps. I trimmed the seam allowances and pressed them up towards the collar with the help of my tailor's ham, and then I stitched that in by hand. I added top stitching to that to match the rest of the collar. And I know you may find that unnecessary, but I think this looks much neater and more professional, so it's worth the extra few minutes it takes for me. Anyway, I turned the button plackets to the inside along the second fold line on the hem and stitched it down to create a lovely finish on my facings. Then I trimmed just the facing and flipped this right side out, using my point turner to help achieve those crispy corners. Using my seam gauge, I started working on my hem. I first folded the hem up the total hem allowance amount. The hem allowance is not always the same as your seam allowance, so double check your pattern if you're unsure. For me, the seam allowance was 1 centimeter and the hem allowance was 2 centimeters. You can press that in place if you want, but I chose to skip that step this time. Next, I fold the raw edge in and pin that in place, creating a narrow hem. Again, you can press that in place at this stage, and I definitely do that very often, but for more unruly fabrics usually. I top stitched the hem in place and also went ahead and added a top stitch to both edges of the button plackets. I think I was definitely in a top stitching mood when I made this blouse. finish the armholes, I used some leftover black cotton sateen bias tape I made for my Hades jumper dress, which I really am so glad I kept. I could maybe use the back ruffles I didn't end up needing to make some matching bias, but not only was that more work, but it also would be so annoying to make because it would have a million seams. I pinned the black bias to the armholes with right sides together, folding back the seam allowance on the short edges of the bias to hide them. Then I stitched that in place with the seam allowance provided in the pattern. I trimmed the seam allowance and decided to also trim back the bias because I did make this 2 inches or 5 centimeters wide. And for this seam, I thought it would turn out too bulky. If I was making bias from scratch for this seam, I would have made it 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters anyway. When pressing, I do this in stages. First, I press the bias and the seam allowances away from the blouse. Then I fold and press the whole bias in along the seam, making sure it's not visible from the outside. Lastly, I fold and press the remaining raw edges of the bias in to hide them and pin that in place. I top stitched that in place, and I really was in a top stitching mood because I did 1 row on the edge of the armhole and 1 about 1 centimeter in to catch the bias. Usually I would sew that by hand for a more invisible finish. I picked out the buttons I wanted. They're a very cute set of vintage orange shank buttons, and I used them to mark the buttonholes along one of the button plackets. I marked them with pins and chalk because I was having a hard time seeing them in this fabric. I made the buttonholes on my machine. Then I marked the placement of the buttons using my buttonholes and stitched them in by hand. And then I was ready for the reveal.